And welcome to IAJF's webinar with special guest, Dr. Behzad Tabatabaei. Tonight, we will be discussing lessons from the Iranian Revolution and why the 2020 US election matters. World news and politics are extremely important to all our daily lives, but are sometimes difficult to follow or understand. That is why IAJF is proudly providing these free educational webinars and resources to support and encourage our community this voting season. We ask that you would also support us by donating to the Federation so that we may continue offering the services and protections we have provided for 40 years. Nonprofits are being hit especially hard during COVID-19 and can only sustain with the help and generosity of all of you. I would like to thank Mr. Jubin Eshaqian from Eshaqian Insurance Companies and Services for conducting and helping with the webinar series, the election webinar series. Thank you very much. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Behzad Tabatabaei. Dr. Behzad Ben Tabatabaei is an international business and political economist who has advised US policymakers on foreign policy issues. He has also counseled private companies as well as foreign governments on strategic investments, public relations, and economic development. Dr. Tabatabaei is an adjunct faculty member at the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine University. He has also taught at University of Southern California, the Center for Counterintelligence and Security Studies, and the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, as well as training the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force on foreign threats emanating from the Middle East to the US homeland. Dr. Tabatabaei graduated from USC with 2 master's degrees and a PhD in international political economy and public policy. Thank you so much for joining Iranian American Jewish Federation tonight and giving us your time and expertise in discussing the important matters before the elections. Thank you. May I start with the first question?
Sure.
What was the general condition of Iran in the 1960s and 70s, Dr. Tabatabaei?
Well, it was very interesting because Iran in the 1960s and 70s had achieved one of the fastest and largest economic growth rates in the world. Annual GDP rate measured 10 to 12%. Iran was considered a stable country in a very challenging neighborhood. Iran did not experience the political and economic turmoil that gripped countries like Italy, France, England, Germany, and even in the United States in the 1960s and early 1970s. There was no large-scale protest at the same time in Iran.
What destructive ideologies legitimized the revolution?
Well, basically, there were 2 main ideologies that were destructive. One was the leftist ideology, and the other was the Islamist ideology. The Shah always warned about the marriage of the black representing the black turbans of the clerics, and the red representing leftism, socialism, communism ideologies of the left. It was the left that provided the intellectual legitimacy of the revolution, and the Islamists, for most part, provided the manpower.
Dr. Tabatabaei, would you further explain these ideologies? And on the surface, they seem incompatible in their worldview, but why is it that we see them even in the West? They cooperate with each other?
Well, both leftism and Islamism are totalitarian ideologies and seek complete political, economic, and social control over the society. Islamism is essentially political Islam. It seeks to enforce Sharia law over the whole society by any means necessary, including the use of violence or force. When Khomeini was in exile, he would often complain that he did not want the Persian version of Islam, which placed Islam within the bounds of Persian culture, of tolerance and compassion. Khomeini would often say that he wanted the Mohammedan version of Islam as it existed in the Arabian Peninsula 1400 years ago. When the Arabs attacked Persia almost 1400 years ago, they committed unspeakable religious, cultural, social, and intellectual genocide in Persia. They destroyed the world's largest library at the capital of Persia at the time, with over 40,000 volumes. They also destroyed 700 Zoroastrian fire temples. Each one of these fire temples had a library attached to them, which also traced the genealogy of all Iranian families. They introduced slavery, and the Arabs banned even the speaking of the Persian language. For almost 2 centuries, 200 years, there was not a single work of Persian that has survived. The Islamists wanted to start history with the advent of Islam. Anything before had to be dismissed. Leftism also believes in reinventing history and dismissing the collective history, tradition, and institutions of the past. They believe it must be dismissed, belittled, and derided if necessary, and by force, it must be destroyed if necessary. And both ideologies, by the way, want to establish a utopia, a perfection. And of course, humans, they believe, will become perfect when societies are perfect. This is the antithesis of both Iranian and American foundational beliefs. As humans, we believe we strive to be decent. When we are decent, we will make decent societies, we will make societies better, and we will work toward a more perfect union, which was the antithesis of both what the leftists believe and the Islamicists believe.
So you mentioned utopia. What does utopia mean, Dr. Tabatabaei?
Well, U in Latin means no, topia means place, which means no place. It's very ironic. It means it is a place outside of reality. It cannot be achieved. In attempting to achieve utopia, you can only achieve dystopia. We have witnessed this in Iran. The leftist and the Islamicist utopia, or their version of paradise, has combined to become the living hell for 80 million Iranians.
Very unfortunate. What was the counterculture movement?
Well, the social upheaval that had been inspired in the West, and especially in the US against the Vietnam War, was absent for most part in Iran. The counterculture, which is a movement whose values and norms of behavior differ substantially from those of mainstream society. They often exhibit vehement opposition to mainstream cultural mores and norms. The counterculture was organized by the left, inspired by people like Stalin, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, Castro, Che Guevara. Many young people participated in this process because of the indoctrination they received at their universities in the West. Ironically, the left is responsible for the death of over 100 million people in the last century, in the 20th century.
Can you tell us what had Iran under the leadership of the late Shah achieved before the 1979 revolution in terms of foreign policy?
Sure. Despite bordering the Soviet Union and being a close ally of the US, it maintained a friendly relationship both economically and politically with the Soviet Union. Iran recognized China in 1970, and the Chinese government maintained close ties with Iran, and they were very grateful for that recognition. This happened before the US recognition of China. They gave the Iranian Prime Minister Hoveyda and Her Majesty the Queen an unprecedented welcome reception. This is before President Nixon's trip to China, and the Shah conveyed this to his good friend, President Nixon, and essentially signaled that China was open to having relationship with the United States. Next, the Shah fought communist insurgents in Pakistan and Oman. It convinced Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia to leave the Soviet sphere of influence and work with the West. After the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the Shah convinced Israel to give back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, and in turn, it would provide Israel oil it was extracting from the Sinai. He also convinced Egypt that if they would accept peace with Israel, that he would provide the expertise and funds necessary to fix the Suez Canal that was damaged during the war, which he did. He laid the foundation for the Camp David Accords. He became close friends with President Sadat of Egypt, and in exile, President Sadat remained friends with the Shah and provided him with a state funeral for which many Iranians are forever grateful. Later, the Shah provided peacekeepers in Lebanon to prevent leftist Palestinians from infiltrating Israel. He did not allow US bases in Iran and rejected the idea of nuclear weapons being deployed in north of Iran against the Soviets. He established an Iranian version of the US Peace Corps and provided aid to over 40 different countries. The Shah also provided a $1 billion loan to England. And it also kept Iran out of over 26 different regional conflicts during his reign.
Amazing. And what did Iran under the late Shah accomplish domestically?
Let's start with the White Revolution, which essentially was providing crown lands to farmers, so they could own their own land and not just be tenant farmers, giving the right to females to vote. For the 2,500-year celebrations of the monarchy of Iran, the Iranian government built 3,200 schools by October of 1971 before the celebrations, adding additional capacity for 120,000 students to come to school. Every child received a free meal a day in school. They doubled the salaries of all teachers in Iran. All university education in Iran was free, and there was grants available for studying abroad. Free medical insurance was provided for the poor. Due to the criticism of human rights, which was very important, he invited the International Red Cross to come to Iran in 1977, and he accepted all their recommendations regarding human rights and prison conditions. And they were adopted, and legislation was passed enshrining these changes. They included better meals in prison, ping pong tables, movie nights, TVs, radios, access to newspapers, and every prisoner had to be presented within 10 minutes after the International Red Cross requested their name. And International Red Cross set up offices not only in Tehran, but in different cities. They issued 3 reports. By the 3rd report, they mentioned that no country in the world had made the changes that Iran had made, and at the pace that Iran had made them. And they were very, very pleased by what had happened. There were female officers, pilots, judges, attorneys, and other professions were opened up to females. It had the least amount of corruption in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, with the possible exception of Japan, but they had a serious organized crime problem, which Iran did not have, and that brings with it a whole host of other types of corruption.
So with everything that you mentioned now, why did the revolution happen?
Well, mainly we see that the pseudo-intellectuals of the left succumbed to a mixture of postmodernism and Marxism. They were intellectually very lazy people. They did not argue the policies of the Shah on its merits. They would not debate the policies of the Shah. There was legitimate criticism that could be constructive, and the system was open to it. As a matter of fact, many former Marxists would join the ranks of government officials and work within the system. But most leftists would engage in ad hominem attacks relentlessly. They, like the Islamists, were ashamed of Persian history and culture. The students who studied abroad had succumbed to leftist indoctrination, and in Iran, the universities were hotbeds of activism for the leftists. Some educated and not so educated people believed the lies of the leftists and were caught up in the counterculture movement. It was very fashionable in the late 1970s. And the Shah and his government did not communicate with the Iranian people about everything they had accomplished. The court did not have a press secretary, much less Office of Strategic Communications. In Iran, generally, culturally, they believed in an old Persian parable, that which is obvious does not need to be mentioned. And so almost none of the accomplishments that had happened under the leadership of the Shah were ever advertised to the general population. It was just presumed that people would understand these things internally. And nobody thought, well, people are busy with their lives, with so many things they had to do, and you need to advertise. They needed to use the type of mediums that were available to them on radio, TV, newspapers, debates, various civic clubs to argue about these things, to advertise them, but that never happened. At the beginning of summer of 1978, and I should mention, by the end of 1977, nobody believed a revolution in Iran would succeed. It was unthinkable. When the protests started beginning in mass in 1978, there were about 600 plus troublemakers that were arrested at the beginning of the summer of 1978. Everything pretty much died down during the summer. It was only after they were released due to political and social pressure that anti-government movements succeeded. 3 weeks later, the whole of Tehran was up in flames. And I should also mention a few things. We have witnessed the same thing over the last several months in the United States. It was United States being one of the most stable countries in the world. But civilization in general is extremely fragile. In Iran, when the Shah changed prime ministers, a man by the name of Sharif Emami, he also believed that you have to meet the demands of the protesters. And if you just give in to their demands, things will settle down. And so he legitimized their lies. Ayatollah Shariat Madari, a grand Ayatollah, and this is, think of social pressure. He went to Sharif Emami and said that if you release these 600 plus troublemakers, then I can say that my word carries much more weight than Khomeini does. And the head of Savak, because Sharif Emami felt that they should be released, acquiesced and agreed, they released them. And we see that in cities in the United States where the mayors or the governors were not willing to employ the National Guard and arrest people who were troublemakers, that it spun out of control. When you look at Minneapolis, a very beautiful, pleasant city in the United States, over $1.5 billion worth of damage because of rioting and arson. So things can get out of hand very, very quickly. Mayor Giuliani of New York said every time there were troublemakers, I would tell the police to arrest them immediately, and then everything would calm down and they could have a dialogue and people would go home. But if you don't arrest troublemakers, then it brings more and more bad elements into the streets, and things get out of hand, and they get out of hand very, very quickly.
Former Mayor Giuliani.
Yes, former Mayor Giuliani.
Yes. I think this is extremely important for the younger generation to be aware of and to know what happened in Iran and the similarities between then and what is happening in the US now.
I think what is also very, very important in this process is that essentially destroying the past is very, very important for people with leftist ideologies. And we have witnessed much of this in the United States. So inside of Iran, for example, they would constantly mention that Iran was a lackey of the United States. And as clearly it has been shown, that wasn't the case. There were no US bases inside of Iran. Even the military equipment the Shah purchased from United States, he purchased from other countries as well, and it was diversified. There were military advisors in of United States inside of Iran for training, but so were from other countries. There were a lot of Israelis that lived in Iran. As a matter of fact, the largest expat community of Israelis were inside of Iran. And Iran was part of CENTO, and United States essentially had to pull its capabilities out of CENTO and be a symbolic member of CENTO, because the Shah would not allow the Iranian military to be commanded by other countries or other armies. And so essentially in CENTO, which was Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan, it was the Iranian military that controlled CENTO. So none of these types of ad hominem attacks were correct or truthful. And we see this here in the United States, attacking the very foundations of the United States, that this was a horrible country from its beginning, that it was a racist country, which is not true. Shortly after United States was established, United States sent ships around the Horn of Africa to prevent slave ships from taking slaves abroad. It captured some of these ships. It attacked sanctuaries where there were slave traders. So all of these things were done in the United States, but the constant ad hominem attacks, because if you can destroy a people's past, then essentially they have no future. And it's very easy to come up with a counter narrative, a counterculture. And it's important to remember Will Durant, the great historian who wrote 11-volume history of civilization called The Story of Civilization. In his lessons of history, he says that no one man or group, no matter how wise or capable, can in one generation gain enough wisdom to collectively dismiss the collective wisdom of all previous generations, and this includes their history and institutions. And we see this happening, unfortunately, on the left inside of the United States. Go ahead.
Very wise words. We have a question here that please ask about the problems in Iranian culture, why millions followed Khomeini, and what are those issues in our culture causing this to happen?
That's an excellent question, and I like to get rid of another false narrative that has existed, that millions of Iranians were joyous and actively participating in the revolution. Of the provinces inside of Iran, only majority of the provinces in Iran were stable without any protest. It was mostly large urban centers, which sounds very familiar to us here in the United States. These large urban centers, less than 7% of the Iranian population participated in the revolution. And even inside of Tehran, we had several marches in favor of the Shah and the regime. 400,000, 500,000, 250,000. Lots of people came at different times, even during the upheavals, but they were not encouraged. And when the Shah left, almost 400,000 people showed up chanting for the Shah to return and for the upheaval to end. Unfortunately, Prime Minister Bakhtiyar prevented them from marching throughout Tehran, but he would allow those who were marching against the regime to have full access all over Tehran. And that became very, very problematic. And the moment you legitimize the lies that have been told about a people, about their government, about their history, essentially that becomes the end. I like to mention one other thing. Sharif Amami became the prime minister. Savak, which had 9 different divisions, he fired 31 of the 51 heads of division heads of SAVAK, senior members of SAVAK. When Bakhtiar came into office, he knew nothing about all the reforms that had been done in regards to human rights, and he dismissed categorically and dismantled the entire organization. He fired everyone. And in a cabinet meeting, he asked for a security report, and the general in charge of security said, "I have none to give because you have gotten rid of the entire security apparatus of the country." We see the same thing happening in the United States when various mayors hold back the police chiefs or fire the police chief or cut back the budget and don't support the police to arrest troublemakers in the streets. Then things get out of hand very, very quickly because civilization is very, very fragile. And we saw the same thing inside of Iran. When the security apparatus withdrew, then pretty much the protesters succeeded. And even inside of Iran, before the success of the revolution, we saw Muslim clerics going to villages and their supporters confiscating people's homes, even small villages or lands that they have. So there was a lot of complaint. When there is not equal justice under the law, and they talk about social justice, which is not justice at all. It means that you want Lady Justice to remove her blindfold and wink to particular groups. Environmental justice is not justice. Social justice is not justice. Racial justice is not justice. And that's exactly what happened to Iran. Certain groups were predominantly favored. So the majority of Iranians did not participate in the revolution. There was a huge silent majority, but nobody fought for the silent majority. And if people don't fight for the silent majority, the same thing can happen inside of the United States.
Actually, that is related to the next question here that they asked. What recommendations do you have for Iranian citizens here to be proactive in defending against another revolution?
Yes, well, I think the case in the United States is not as dire as Iran because I can say that the conservatives inside of the United States, people who want to conserve our wonderful history, the wonderful history of the United States as established by the Founding Fathers and enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, have done are doing a much better job by accessing various social media platforms, from talk radio to television to social media, Facebook, despite the fact that there's unfortunately censorship by some media tech giants. Overall, getting the message out is extremely important. If people don't defend what this country has stood for and what it stands for, then we have a problem. But I take heart in seeing millions and millions of Americans fighting and believing in a more perfect union.
The next question is, how will the theological absolutism of Islam become aligned with relativism of democracy? How will you judge a Biden presidency and Iranians' demand for regime change in Iran?
Well, certainly, I think it's been fairly established, especially during the Obama-Biden administration, that they essentially provided Iran a lifeline. In 2009, the Obama administration and President Obama could have sided with the Iranian people. The Iranian people were chanting, "Are you with us or are you with them?" For days he was absent, and finally when he gave a press conference on this issue, he said that we do not side with the people. The regime at first was very hesitant to crack down, but once Obama gave the green light that they would not interfere, the regime cracked down with full force. And essentially, we see that in the United States, unfortunately, people who believe in Islamicism have found a home with leftists within the Democratic Party, and there's a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism that's spewed. Unfortunately, in the United States, coming from the left, who are willing to tolerate Islamicists because they believe that their greatest enemies are conservatives. And it's very unfortunate. And there is the absolutism of Islamicism is the antithesis of Iranian culture, society, and political philosophy. It has no place in Iran. And it's very obvious that right now, if Vice President Biden becomes president, he will restart the nuclear deal once again, which would lift all the sanctions on the regime, and it would invigorate the regime, which would be flush with cash and resources, not only to suppress its own people, but continue to assist the worst elements in the Middle East, from the Assad regime to the Houthis in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon and other places, to continue to commit great and systematic violations of human rights.
There's a question here that how can we speak up to enlighten friends who are on the left on the dangers our country faces without the fear of being labeled as anti-American?
Well, people have to speak out because there's too much on the line. The price is too high. When people didn't speak up during the Russian Revolution, the price was 40 million Russians who were killed. When people didn't speak up during the Maoist revolution in China, the price was 70 million people. When people didn't speak up in Cambodia, it was 2 million. When people didn't speak in Cuba, it's 50 plus years of misery and destruction in Cuba. And when people didn't speak up and did not fight for their values, for a free and secular Iran, and the result is 41 years of misery and destruction. The price is too high, and we can't allow the same thing to happen in the United States.
Very sad. One of the participants is saying that indoctrination has begun in our children's schools. My children are taught that America is a racist country based on racist values. What can we do?
Well, I think this is very important. If you look at what happened in Iran, a lot of people who ended up in prominent positions after the revolution as part of the Islamic regime were active in various ministries, including the Ministry of Education in Iran. And some of them had managed to infiltrate and even change various textbooks before the revolution to indoctrinate children. So this is very, very important. People have to be active at the local level. They have to complain to the school district. They have to listen to some of the lectures. And now that almost everything is online, they have to listen to what their teachers are saying. If their teachers are trying to indoctrinate children, they have to speak up. They have to complain to the principal. A lot of people just give in because of intimidation by the left, but if people fight back, then the left can't intimidate people. This is very, very important, and nothing is further from the truth. United States is the most diverse, culturally, socially, religiously, ethnically country, and the least racist country in the history of our planet. And again, this idea of utopia or perfection is very, very destructive. We cannot compare United States to some false idea of utopia. We have to compare United States to other countries, and what United States and its people have been able to achieve is essentially, in my opinion, a miracle. No other society has managed to achieve what United States has.
The next question is, can you discuss the moral argument against socialism that conservatives can use, namely voting to rob people of land and money to redistribute is still theft?
Absolutely. So what happens a lot of times when conservatives are trying to discuss socialism, they will say, well, socialism has failed, or look at Venezuela, the wealthiest country in Latin America, and socialist policies have destroyed Venezuela. Absolute poverty has risen many folds. The only people who are now wealthy are the elites of the regime, including the daughter of Hugo Chavez, who's a billionaire, but average Venezuelans are suffering. Well, we shouldn't just talk about the the lack of utility of socialist policies. And wherever socialism has been tried, it's been destructive. And Scandinavia, by the way, they're not socialist countries. The Prime Minister of Denmark repeatedly, as well as other people from other Scandinavian countries, have said that they are not socialist. They're capitalist countries with a high tax rate, but they're not socialist countries. As a matter of fact, their corporate taxes are even lower than the United States. Their individual tax rate is high, but not their corporate taxes. We need to talk about the morality of socialism. Whether 51 people, for example, if someone has $10 and 51 people in a room vote to take $9 of that $10, or all of that $10 from that person and give it to other people, is still theft. Whether one person does it or a majority do it, is still theft. It makes absolutely no difference. And we have to really emphasize this point, that socialism is an immoral doctrine. And essentially, for those who believe in the Ten Commandments, it makes government into God. So that's one of the commandments: thou shalt have no false idols before me. It makes people covet their neighbor's belonging, and covetousness or wanting other people's goods has led to tremendous amount of suffering, and we've seen that in the 20th century. 110 million people have died in the process. So essentially, these are anti-civilizational philosophies that are very, very destructive.
We have a question here that where do you see Iran now? Where is Iran now?
Well, I think right now Iran is in a very, very precarious situation. So as we see with the rise of China, that China goes to various countries, tries to scoop up their national resources, provides them some funding, and then calls in the loans and takes over their infrastructure or their natural resources. China is very, very interested in having access to the oil and gas deposits inside of Iran. The regime in Iran says we want to do a $400 billion 25-year deal investment. The Chinese have never acknowledged this. The Chinese would never spend $400 billion inside of Iran. The only type of deal the Chinese are willing to make with the government of Iran is that they would produce enough oil and gas to meet the domestic consumption of China, and they would purchase that at a minimal price, almost for nothing. And they would, the price would be essentially increasing oil and gas production for their own domestic consumption. The only thing that's maintaining the territorial integrity of Iran right now, And preventing Iran from becoming the gas station of China or a very poor province of China is the sanctions that President Trump has placed on Iran. Because those sanctions prevent any country in the world from doing business with Iran, because the entire banking system would come under US sanctions. And President Xi has repeatedly assured President Trump that they're not willing to jeopardize their multi-billion-dollar economic relationship with United States for the sake of Iran. Right now, essentially, the sanctions are saving Iran. Second, if Biden becomes president, those sanctions will be lifted, and God knows what will happen to Iran. And it could either be dismembered, as we see there is a national identity inside of Iran, but Khomeini repeatedly said nationalism is the enemy of Islam, and the leftists also believe that nationalism is the enemy of leftism. They believe in tribalism. They try to destroy national symbols in favor of tribal symbols. So when you burn the US flag, when you're disrespectful to the national anthem of the United States, you're destroying national symbols. In the United States, where there is different ethnic groups, different religious groups, different cultural mores, the only thing that unites us is the English language, which is not enough, and the symbols of this country and the love of our flag. If that doesn't exist, we're no longer a country. The same thing is true inside of Iran, because national or nation state institutions have been decimated under this regime. The opportunity for troublemakers to try to dismember Iran increases by day. What do I think will happen? I believe in the destiny of Iran. I believe in the destiny of its people. I believe that they have a great future ahead of them, and that the next 4 years will absolutely be pivotal in the history of Iran. And if the opportunity exists for Iranians to be able to reassert themselves, which I believe at some point will exist in the next 4 years, Iran can have one of the strongest economies and become one of the most stable countries in the world. It has everything it needs in terms of natural resources, financial capital, and human capital. The only major obstacle from preventing its success is the current clerical regime in power.
Next question is, your PhD thesis suggested that the Islamic Republic's ideology is bound to destroy its economy, which it did, and will lead to its fall. At which point is that fall expected to happen?
Well, I actually believe that it's the political rules that determine economic outcomes. So I don't believe that the collapse of the Iranian economy will lead to the demise of the clerical regime. I believe bad political decisions, and essentially at some point in the next 4 years, inaction by the regime because of severe division and upheaval inside of the country will bring about its collapse. And they're not unified politically. They have a very difficult time administrating this vast country, the vast Iranian plateau. And I think that will essentially lead to the demise of the regime, not the collapse of its economy.
Next question is on another subject, actually. It's what is your opinion about Affordable Care Act, and what would happen if the Supreme Court decides to dismantle it?
I don't think anything devastating is going to happen in the process, essentially because the individual mandate has already been ruled unconstitutional. It's no longer practical. The only reason Obamacare was able to be enacted and people could have pre-existing conditions could be covered was because the insurance companies were going to force young people to buy insurance plans. Because they were healthy, the cost of their healthcare would be minimal, but because they were paying dues, those dues would be used to cover the elderly population or people with pre-existing conditions. Because the individual mandate has essentially been thrown out, that no longer is a valid model for the insurance companies. Second, in order to pass Obamacare, you could not have basic healthcare plans. Every plan had to cover everything. So there was no possibility to purchase things at a minimal level for your needs. So it made healthcare coverage overall much more expensive. The way you deal with healthcare problems is, first of all, anybody with pre-existing conditions, which is about roughly 4 million people, not 120 million people, it's 4 million people. And they're at different levels. What you do is you allow them to purchase insurance, but you charge them, the insurance company should be able to charge a higher premium. But depending on their income, they should pay the same amount that someone without a pre-existing condition is paying. If their income is below a certain level, then the government should subsidize the difference between what everybody else is paying and the higher premium. It should not subsidize the entire amount. And people who can afford to pay the higher premium for pre-existing conditions then should pay the higher premiums. That's how insurance works. So, and of course, if you allow people to purchase insurance across state lines, then you have over 400 different companies that can compete for your business. That lowers the cost. If you allow people to see how much they're being charged for an MRI at a particular hospital or a clinic, that lowers the cost. If your transparency dramatically lowers the cost of healthcare, and that's how various reforms within the healthcare system should be handled, not this massive government bureaucracy where it says one plan fits all.
I wanted to ask you this question, that where do you see President Trump, what would you think that President Trump would accomplish another 4 years at the White House in the administration, and what would their accomplishments be in the next 4 years if he's elected?
In regards to foreign policy, we see that this is very significant. The peace treaty between Israel, normalization of relationships between UAE, Bahrain, and now Sudan. These are countries that did not have border disputes with Israel. They were not engaged in a war with Israel. These are countries that had ideological differences, and President Trump was able to leverage his leadership skills to bring about 3 countries to normalize their relationship with Israel. This also shows the isolation of the regime in Iran, that the various countries in the region fear the destructive forces within the clerical regime within Iran, and that's why they want to ally themselves with the state of Israel against a destructive regime in Iran. And if you look at Sudan, this is a country where Iran has had a long-standing relationship with Sudan. They had over 2,000 Revolutionary Guards in Sudan, training the Sudanese to commit a genocide in Darfur at a cost of 400,000 Sudanese. They used the ports in Sudan. They had close relationships with Al-Qaeda when it was in Sudan and Osama bin Laden. And we see after 9/11, senior members of Al-Qaeda were allowed to come into Iran. So despite all of the advantages and relationships that Iran had with Sudan. Sudan decided to choose the state of Israel. This regime is becoming more and more isolated day by day. In regards to domestic policy, I think once COVID is over, that the US economy will take off like a rocket. It will provide a tremendous amount of upward mobility, wage increases, and we saw this before COVID. I think the same process will continue. And if it wasn't because of his domestic economic policies, I have absolutely no doubt that China would have overtaken the United States. And the rise of China is a very destructive force for the entire planet because of the way the Chinese handle their uneven relationship with other countries.
That's very important. Will the US relationship with Israel be strengthened more with a Trump presidency or a Biden presidency?
Well, I mean, it's very, very obvious that President Trump was the only president that kept his commitment and moved the US Embassy to Jerusalem. There is very close ties now between the United States and the State of Israel under the Trump administration. We saw under the Obama-Biden administration that when Prime Minister Netanyahu came to Iran and had a very legitimate concern regarding the nuclear program inside of Iran, the Obama White House would not even invite him into the White House and for him to be able to share his concerns with President Obama. And at the same time, they hired political consultants to try to defeat him in the Israeli election, interference in the election of another country. So I think certainly the Trump administration will be better both for the Israelis, for the Arabs, and I believe also for Iran. The regime in Iran is not capable of negotiating a permanent solution with United States. If their anti-Americanism is gone, their anti-Israelism has to be put aside as well, because United States is the great Satan, Israel is the small Satan, and there is animosity toward their own population, especially their female population, is not enough to unite the very small remnants of the regime who support their ideology. So they can never come to a peaceful negotiations or a full peaceful arrangement with the United States. That will never happen.
We have a couple more questions, Dr. Tabatabaei. One is, was there an Antifa or BLM similar movements in Iran before the revolution?
Absolutely. We know there were quite a few Palestinian guerrillas. Estimates range from several hundred to 2,500 that had entered Iran. We know there were Marxist guerrillas. We know there were mujahideen inside of Iran. They were receiving arms shipments. They were instigating people. Sometimes during protests, they would fire into crowds to antagonize them. They would fire at the soldiers trying to maintain security. They were very, very violent, and their goal was the destruction of the system in the hope of establishing some sort of utopia, and we know how that went.
I think we will end with this last question, which is a delightful question. And it says, do you think the Iranian American younger generation will be able to visit Iran freely in their lifetime?
I have absolutely no doubt that will happen. I believe that there is great things in store for the people of Iran and for Iranian Americans living here in the United States and Europe.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tabatabaei. We are fortunate to have you, a wealth of knowledge and information. We appreciate you giving this time to us and all the attendees. And I hope that we'll have more of these webinars with you in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I want to thank you for hosting this, as well as the Iranian American Jewish Federation. And it was an absolute delight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good night, everyone.